The most important thing for women is this concept of comprehensive care and holistic care. With women, we're starting to see you tear your ACL, but there is a hormonal component, there's a movement pattern component, there's potentially a nutrition-based component. What if they get pregnant? There's all of these different things that make it not just about the knee and not just about the ligament. That sort of multidisciplinary approach is really going to be the future of women's sports.
Hey everyone, we are having our Black Friday, Cyber Monday sale here at mindbodygreen from November 24th to December 3rd. All of our products in our shop get up to 30% off plus a free gift for orders over $99. Go to shop.mindbodygreen.com. The code is DEALS. So if I'm healthy, I'm fit, I'm active, what can I do to prevent injury?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is preparation. And when you're thinking about doing any sort of activities, really, as we get older, we just have to be more careful and kind of do more maintenance in terms of making sure that we stay healthy. So even though some people might say warming up and stretching aren't things that are part of their normal sort of routine, as we get older, it becomes more and more important to be able to do that. And so as we stretch, as we kind of prepare and warm up for activities, we are able to loosen our joints, warm up our muscles, and that actually helps prevent a lot of the types of injuries that we see in adults, which are overuse type injuries or sprains, muscle sprains and strains that we see. I would say the most important thing that we always talk about is not increasing your activities too quickly. So, we see a lot of weekend warriors who used to play recreational soccer or used to play, at a high level and then maybe didn't play for a couple of years and suddenly go back into it. And they end up hurting something or spraining a ligament or straining a muscle. And that sort of jump in activity is probably the number one reason for injuries that we see in adults, because you're just not prepared for that level of activity. And your muscles can really only accommodate an increase in load by a given amount. And if you exceed that, then all of that pressure gets put on your joints or tendons, and that's what leads to injury. So I would say preparation, whether it's in that time period of warming up and stretching for a given activity, but also preparation leading up to whatever it is that you want to do at a given time. If it's, a competition or, a weekend excursion or something like that, and making sure that leading up to that, you're prepared by, doing some amount of training so that it's not too much of a jump when you get started.
So a couple of things I want to unpack there with the first point, stretching. How does one know it's enough? Is it a feeling? Is it a certain duration? What is it?
Yeah, so I would say, there is a feeling to it, but I think that being mindful about how you're doing it is really important. So one of the things that people always kind of skip with this is, they'll do it, they'll stretch, and then they'll kind of move on. But really focusing on symmetry, I think, is really important. So one of the things that we commonly see in women that's different than in men is that women tend to be asymmetric. And when you're asymmetric in your strength and flexibility, then that can lead to almost a relative overuse on one part of the body. And that can lead to, these types of injuries that we see more commonly in women. So I would say that if you are doing a stretch, making sure that you're being very purposeful about being the same on both sides, holding it the same amount of time on both sides, getting the same amount of stretch on both sides to really ensure that you're getting kind of a well-rounded, equally distributed stretch.
And then the other part of the equation was not pushing yourself too hard. And I can speak from experience. I played basketball through college, and there were definitely times through high school and college where I wasn't necessarily in the best shape and showed up to, quote unquote, training camp. And your coach didn't care about it. Was full tilt from day one. And when I wasn't in the best shape, I was just so feeling it. And probably within a couple of weeks, I got injured. Like I would always do a little something when I wasn't in the best shape. And so I've got ingrained in me this kind of inner knowing, if you will, as I'm pretty active now. I try to slowly push day by day because I really do not want to get injured. Because I can speak from experience. I know when I go full tilt and I'm not in great shape, not going to end well. But how does the person who can't speak to that experience of knowing what it's like to fully push yourself to exhaustion when you're not ready for it. Like, how do you think about like increasing the load?
Yeah, that's a great question because that's the one thing that you really can't tell in that moment, right? Like, I think most people, when they're set on doing a workout, can try to get through it. And people always ask me, well, how do I know when something is too much? And really, when you're in the midst of it, it's really hard to know. But what we generally recommend is that you don't increase your activities by more than 20% per week. And that can be in terms of load or intensity or volume. And so if you know where you're starting and you know that you've been, walking X number of steps in a week, but you haven't been running, then you have to start out really light and say start out with 10 minutes of whatever you're doing, then you kind of stay at that for that week. And the next week is not 30 minutes. It's, 12 minutes and then 15 minutes. And that sort of percentage increase really helps to keep you within what we call the envelope of, what your body can accommodate. As you know, when you work out, you're kind of breaking down muscle and then building it back up. But there's only a certain amount that you can accommodate, after which all of that load, as I mentioned previously, gets put on the tendons and on the joints. And so that 20% usually ends up being a pretty good guideline for most people.
And for people who like to play recreational sports, are there certain sports or ranges of motion that are just not great? And what comes to mind for me is, being a pitcher in baseball. To me, if I look at that range of motion with the arm, I'm just like, oh, my shoulder's hurting thinking about doing that 100 times at max capacity. What ranges of motion and what sports should people be aware of?
Yeah, I would say it's not specifically about the range of motion, but it's about some of the other things that you touched on. One is the repetitive motion. So doing the same thing over and over can be a way that, people can get overuse injuries of the joints. So that's one. And so diversifying your workouts, I think, is really important. So if you want to, I don't know, play baseball in a rec league, or you want to, even for our youth athletes, we know that if you play more than one sport and that you're not specializing in a single sport at a young age, your chances of becoming injured are much less. And so we kind of take that and apply that to adults as well. The other thing is the explosive nature of that. So it's not necessarily getting into a certain position, but it's the fact that you have to really do it at a really forceful speed. And so that can happen in baseball. It can happen in soccer with the sudden cutting and pivoting movements. It can happen in CrossFit when you're doing box jumps. But those explosive movements, which we refer to as sort of a plyometric movement, puts the most stress on a muscle because the muscle is elongated while it's contracting. And that is what, generates the most force, but also leads to the highest risk of injury.
What about the racket sports, specifically the explosion of pickleball?
Yeah, same thing. We see a lot of pickleball injuries. And I think, again, it's some of those quick movements where you're suddenly changing direction as well. And that kind of brings us into a whole different area where if you're trying to change directions quickly, you see a lot of knee injuries because people tend to pivot and the knee will give way. And it's usually, an entire body fitness type thing that kind of leads into knee injuries because you have to have good control of your body. You have to have good core strength, good hip strength, good lower extremity balance in order to be able to control your movements during those quick motions. And if you don't, that's when you can be at the highest risk for having a knee injury, ACL injury, meniscus injury, things like that.
Well, can we talk about ACL specifically? Because that one, I think it's 8 times more common in women than men. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's more so that women are 4 to 8 times more likely to sustain an ACL injury than men. So if you look at the number of ACL injuries, they're still more common in men, but you're more likely. And so the reasons for that, some of it has to do with the morphology. So women have wider hips. They have a different center of gravity. And, there may be some considerations of hormonal differences that are currently being investigated. But the number one modifiable risk factor when it comes to ACL injury has to do with differences in movement patterns. So we know that if you take a female athlete and a male athlete and just compare the way that they land and they cut and they pivot, women tend to have a weaker core. They tend to have less muscle strength in their hamstrings, so that when they land, their knee kind of falls into a certain position, putting them at more risk for injury. And there's actually studies that show that if you address these muscle imbalances that women are more likely to have, then you can reduce the risk of ACL injury by almost 75%. So this is something that, yeah, we've spent a lot of time investing in community education and getting the word out there that, it's not just an unavoidable event. A lot of people think, oh, an ACL injury, I've heard about it on ESPN. It's a collision type thing that happens in football. That's actually not the case. In women in particular, it usually happens when they cut and they pivot and the knee just buckles and gives way. And so if we're able to strengthen the muscles around the knee, strengthen the core that supports your body position during those motions, you can actually reduce your risk to make it equal to that of a male athlete.
So the core, hamstrings, but also quads. I would have led with quads because the quads kind of wrap around the kneecap. So I found it interesting that you went core, hamstrings, and then around the knee.
Actually, women tend to be more quad dominant. And so being quad dominant means that your hamstrings are not as effective. And your hamstrings are actually what protect your ACL during those motions. So when you're quad dominant, when you land from a jump, you tend to land with your knees a little bit straighter. You don't go as much into flexion. And so when your knees are landing straight and they're not able to bend as much, it ends up putting a twisting motion on the knees. So quad strength is always important. And we always talk about it in our patients when they're recovering from any sort of knee injury. But in this specific event, it's really the muscle balance, which is so much more important than just the basic strength. And the hamstrings are a huge component of that.
Well, I'm glad you brought up balance because I think, as you mentioned, there are certain sports, well, a lot of sports where it's so repetitive, where it's, the same arm over and over, or like the same jumping movement over and over and over. And it's easy to become imbalanced. And even if we're working out, like I think a lot of people tend to like work out and spend more time on the things they want to work on. And imbalance can happen. So how do you think about balance in general and the body and this idea of avoiding injury just through like being more balanced?
That's a hard one to answer because, it's different for everybody. And they have to kind of think a little bit more globally in terms of how they're working out. And this honestly is where I think there's the most value in having a second set of eyes, whether it is a physical therapist or a personal trainer or somebody who is just going to oversee a little bit of what you're doing and provide some insight and some feedback in terms of your movement patterns and also the types of workouts that you're doing. Because as you said, a lot of people will kind of do the same exercises and they have their routine, but they might be missing something else. And it's hard to know what that is, especially when we're talking about balance. A lot of times when we do this, we're assessing the athletes. And by we, I mean the physical therapists are assessing the athletes and seeing, do they lean to the left or do they lean forward when they're doing any sort of landings? And so these types of exercises that we typically give for injury prevention are really specific to that specific athlete's motion patterns. And so if you were to kind of take that and extrapolate it to, people who are working out and adult athletes, again, having somebody who can maybe give you a couple pointers, look at how you're moving, look at what you're doing for workouts and help you round that out is actually one of the best ways to kind of attain that sort of balance.
So beyond ACL, are there other injuries that there's a big difference between men and women?
Yeah, so the ACL injuries are probably the most studied. We know that kneecap-related injuries, which is something that I treat a lot, tends to be about twice as common in women. And we know that with concussions, for example, we're starting to see some early data that with a given concussion, women are more likely to have more symptoms at a week than a male athlete. So we're starting to see a lot of these types of differences within injury rates, but also the types of, the duration and the severity of the injuries that they have.
What sports, in your opinion, yield the highest amount of injuries?
I think every sport has a risk for injuries, and every sport is different in the types of in the types of injuries that we see. So if we're talking about ACL injuries, which we just were, that's probably the most common in women's soccer, but we also see it in lacrosse, in gymnastics, and things like that. If we look at a very specific population like dance, foot and ankle injuries are going to be the most common there. So I think, that kind of brings us back to when you're treating an athlete, again, individualizing, the not just the treatment protocol, but also what you're doing for them from a preventative training program to really understand what's happening for them as an individual, but also what happens for them as a sport, because each sport is so different in terms of the types of needs and the requirements that the athletes have, but also the types of stresses that they're subjected to.
What about Achilles? Where do you see Achilles injuries happen?
Achilles injuries are probably the most common injury in the weekend warrior, especially in men. So this is the classic case is a 40 to 45-year-old male who decided to play pickup basketball after not having played in a couple years, and then goes up for a jump, feels like he got kicked in the back of the calf and feels a pop. And that's how they tear their Achilles. That happens for a couple of reasons. One being what we talked about in the beginning, which is the sudden increase in the level of activity that someone is doing, which ends up being a little bit too much. The second is that the explosive nature of things like basketball or jumping up, can put more stress on the tendon. And then the last part, which we haven't quite talked about yet, is, this process of aging. And even though I don't like to think of 40 or 45 as old, we really start to see changes in the body after the age of 30. So in the same way that we see our friends getting gray hair and, getting some wrinkles, that same collagen that makes up our hair and our skin is in our muscles and in our tendons, which means that our tendons become a lot more brittle. They become a lot more stiff. And this is where the stretching is really important. The warming up is really important to try to optimize your function, especially if you're going to do things like play basketball.
Which is why I don't play basketball anymore.
That's smart.
It's a recipe for injury. I love it, but I have good memories of being able to play at a high level, and let's keep them memories. I think a lot of people have the problem when they get over, at least me specifically, is your mind still thinks you can do the things you used to be able to do, but the body just says no.
Right.
And therein lies the rub.
Well, the answer, because I don't want to be a Debbie Downer about this, I would say the answer is not never. It just requires a lot more maintenance and a lot more effort to be able to continue doing the things that you want to do. So the people who want to run or the people who want to play basketball or ski, they can do it, but, they have to stretch, they have to warm up, they have to do all those things so that they can maintain that.
You have to put in a lot of work to do that. And I think the other thing I'll note is, in my view, you have to love it so much that it hurts not to do the thing because you're willing to risk injury. And in my view, the older you get, building off of your earlier point, the longer it takes to recover from injury. And then you're losing your muscle, you're losing your cardio, and like the effort to get it back. It's just, and you mentioned skiing, and I have to park on skiing for a moment. This is why I've never skied, and I'm not going to pick it up now, because I look at, so I don't love it. I'm not missing anything. I look at it as longevity prevention. Like skiing is like, let's talk about skiing injury. And you could be the greatest skier in the world. Doesn't mean some person's going to nail you from behind you can't see.
Exactly. Skiing is just, I would say of all the ACLs that I operate on, and I do a lot of them, especially during the winter, it's probably at least 50% of the ACLs, maybe more. It's just, and I think it's a combination of the fact that it's very uncontrolled. And as you said, you'd be a great skier, but you never know when someone's going to crash into you or step on your ski or, whatever happens. But there's also people of all levels who are skiing. And so honestly, I see a lot of first-time skiers who end up tearing their ACL. But it's just the perfect recipe for a knee injury.
And if we talk about ACLs again, a lot of ACL injuries are women, yet most of the doctors providing the surgery are men. What is it? It's a very small percentage.
So right now in orthopedic surgery, and it's specifically focusing on sports medicine. So those of us who operate on ACL sports medicine, we're about 5% female.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of the last, area within medicine that's still not quite equal in terms of gender.
So why do you think that is? You think yeah, why?
I think there are a lot of theories about why that might be, and it's absolutely changing. So now, if you look at the trainees and the residency programs, we're approaching 10%, some even more. So everything is starting to change. I think historically, there used to be some sort of notion that you have to be really strong in order to do it, and that you couldn't have a family and some of these things. And I would say more recently, it could be more the fact that, it's seen as a boys' club. And so women, or maybe not encouraged to go into that. That certainly happened to me when I was a medical student. I was told, oh, well, you can't become an orthopedic surgeon because you're a woman. And I was really surprised by that because I didn't think there was anything I couldn't do as a woman. And so for somebody to tell me that was surprising. Now, for me, I don't really listen to words like that, but I would say if you were a medical student and didn't know any better and were told that, that could maybe deter you from going into that field. So, but I think the culture is definitely changing, and the field overall has been putting a lot of effort into recruiting women and making everything so that it's fair and that women aren't seeing barriers, in this process. And I've seen a lot of change even in my career.
That's amazing. And what about studying women?
Yeah. So, that I think part of it is that, there are certain things that are specific to women that maybe men might not think about in terms of some of the hormonal differences and things like that. But honestly, I would say studying women and the data on women is really more relevant to sports in general as opposed to sports medicine. And so I have, kind of an example of when I was a fellow. So I was in training, about 15 years ago. And I was, we were seeing a patient, a female soccer player. So kind of a classic sort of scenario with an ACL tear. And I was with a very famous sports medicine surgeon who was very well known. And he was kind of talking to me and he said, it's really interesting because when I was your age, we never saw this. It was before Title IX. Women didn't really play sports. If they did, they weren't going to play in college or they weren't going to play pro. So we didn't really treat it because you can walk, without an ACL. You just can't play sports. And so I was thinking, well, that's really interesting because basically he's saying he didn't train on operating on women, and it was really after Title IX that, women started playing more sports. There were opportunities in college and now there's opportunities, to play at the professional level. But all of this data now is it's new. And in fact, it's lacking in some ways. And it's because we just haven't had these sorts of athletes around for a long time. And so that's where I think we need to change and be a little bit more aggressive about how we're studying sex differences and how this affects female athletes. But, it is kind of, I don't want to say sad, but I think it would surprise most people to see how little, there is known, at least, about the differences between male and female athletes currently. But I think it'll be really different in 10 years.
Hey everyone, we are having our Black Friday, Cyber Monday sale here at mindbodygreen from November 24th to December 3rd. All of our products in our shop get up to 30% off plus a free gift for orders over $99. Go to shop.mindbodygreen.com. The code is DEALS. Shop.mindbodygreen.com and the code is DEALS. Pick from my favorites. Clean Coffee Plus. Have this multiple times every day. Creatine Plus with taurine and raspberry. Delicious. And protein. Can't forget about protein, everybody. Our grass-fed whey protein isolate plus in vanilla is absolutely delicious. Guys, go to shop.mindbodygreen.com, code DEALS. So if you could wave your magic wand and have unlimited time, resources, and funding for a study, what would you do?
Yeah, that's the magic question. So I would say that the biggest unknown right now for me and what's relevant to us as orthopedic surgeons taking care of female athletes is the role of hormones on ligaments. So there are some data, especially out of Stanford, looking at ACL injuries in some of the female athletes there. And they started doing blood tests before and then following these athletes and then seeing who tore their ACL and who didn't tear their ACL. And a surgeon named Jason Dragoo, when he was still there, found that there's a hormone called relaxin, which tended to be about 4 times higher in the athletes who ended up tearing their ACL. And that was really kind of the first study where we started thinking, this could be really something. Until that point, there were a lot of lab studies, animal studies looking at, the effects of estrogen and how that would weaken the tendons and ligaments. And so there's always been some sort of thought process there. But to see that clinically was kind of the first time that we really started thinking, is there something that we might be able to, prevent or to look at in these patients as we're treating them. But, it turns out that that's not so easy to do. And the reason for that is that everybody has different hormonal cycles, they have different levels of hormones. And this is not just a single blood test that you can do on one day and make a diagnosis. When we're talking tracking hormones, you have to look at, the length of their cycle and catching them in certain phases. And even if two people did have the same level of hormones, one might be more sensitive to that versus not. And then in addition, not to make this too complicated, there are things like in addition to the injury risk because of the ligamentous change, the hormonal changes might influence your movement patterns and also how you decide to take a given risk at any given time, because there's so many downstream effects of hormonal changes. But studying that to me would be the most interesting.
So what do we know about relaxin?
Yeah. So relaxin is the ligament that, we most often hear about this around pregnancy, but, it has to do with the structure and the flexibility of ligaments, essentially. And we know that around pregnancy, a lot of these changes can happen and, your ligaments become lax so that you're able to deliver and give birth and things like that. But we also know that with some of these higher levels, and we don't know why they're higher in some people, it seems like it's clinically associated with the risk of injury. But nothing happens in isolation, right? There's relaxin, there's estrogen, there's progesterone. And so that's what makes it a little tricky. Now, there is one study, it is an animal study, but I really thought this was onto something, which is, people started thinking, well, if the hormonal issue is related to ACL injury and ligament injuries overall, then can we give oral contraceptives to try to change the risk? And I would say right now, the level of the evidence with the studies is not very good. And so even though some small studies say that you might be able to change that risk, it's not something that we do currently in practice. But there was a study, I would say maybe about 7 years ago or so, again, by the same surgeon out of Stanford when he was there. And they actually looked at rats, female rats, and then they treated them with different types of oral contraceptives because multiple types exist, and some are all estrogen, some are all progesterone, some are like a heavy estrogen to progesterone ratio, and some are evenly mixed, essentially. So they're not all the same. And what they found was that if there was more progesterone in the oral contraceptive, then the stiffness of the ACL and the strength of it was actually better in these rats than in the ones that didn't have a lot of progesterone. So the ratio difference, even just that, can make a big difference.
So progesterone as a protective for injury. Wow, that's fascinating.
Potentially. But again, it's, not in isolation. It's relative to estrogen. But yeah, potentially.
So it sounds like there's definitely something hormone related, but not exactly conclusive.
Exactly. So you asked me what would I want to study? Like if I had, my magic wand, it would really be to understand that, because I think there's something there, but it's so hard to quantify.
So do you think we'll get to a point in the future where female athletes competing at a high level will do some sort of hormone therapy during season and competitive to make sure that hormonally they are set up to avoid injury?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that would come with a lot of other maybe potential ethical and regulatory sorts of discussions.
Of course, but who knows?
But I would say that where I see this going, at least from a performance optimization standpoint initially, is that, especially with the development of AI in medicine, we've become so much better at detecting patterns, and that athletes could potentially use this to their benefit to figure out which days are good for heavy training days, which days are good for regenerative days, which days they need more support with, X, Y, or Z, and really using that to modify their training, I think would be like the next obvious step for an application of this.
Which leads me to recovery. I feel like recovery is also fairly new. I think with competitive athletes, a decade or so ago, it was just you pushed yourself to the limit all the time and you really didn't have rest. And now sleep, recovery have become paramount. How do you think about recovery and the role it plays?
Yeah. Recovery is, you're right. It's something that's relatively new. And again, I think hard to define. People have started looking at sleep patterns. They look at time off. They look at, a lot of these different things. From a surgical perspective, I would say that we have not fully integrated that into our recovery sort of protocols from like a recovery from surgery, for example. But we know that it's important. Probably the biggest application of this is when we look at training and return to sports. We talked a little bit about how, there's muscle breakdown when you're working out. And so balancing that in terms of making sure you have enough recovery days in addition to your workout days when you're trying to get back to a certain level of activity is important. But I will say that right now we don't know as much about sleep. We don't know as much about the process behind that and finding the exact formula for an athlete. At least from what I do as a surgeon, we still haven't gotten there yet.
So you work with professional athletes, you work with professional teams, and with regards to women, I want to talk about like what does this look like in the future? Is it, how do you push the boundaries here? It feels like I'm hearing there's going to be endocrinologists, there's, going to be like what's in the mix in the future for women specifically?
Yeah. So I would say probably the most important thing for women is this concept of comprehensive care and holistic care. So for us and for a lot of male athletes being treated by orthopedic surgeons, you tear your ACL, you have surgery, you rehab, you go back. You break your ankle, you have surgery, you rehab, you go back. With women, we're starting to see you tear your ACL, but there is a hormonal component, there's a movement pattern component, there's potentially a nutrition based component. What if they get pregnant? There's all of these different things that make it not just about the knee and not just about the ligament. And so being able to bring multiple specialists together is probably what needs to happen. Now, that's actually the biggest challenge as well, because the way our healthcare system is set up right now is that it's very fragmented. So you get referred from one to another, and it's very rare to see, 10 different types of disciplines all coming together for one patient. And that's what we're trying to build right now is a women's sports medicine center or a program where we can get comprehensive care from any one of us, and if you have an endocrine or a nutrition issue or a sports psych issue, that we can address all of those together instead of doing it piecemeal. And so I think that that sort of multidisciplinary approach is really going to be the future of women's sports.
And what is ACL recovery time today?
It's about a year. So after surgery, there's physical therapy that happens. Most people who are progressing well are able to run and jump around 3 to 4 months. Then they progress to cutting and pivoting around 5 months. And in terms of return to sport, we've learned a lot now in terms of what are the criteria that make it safe for an athlete to return to sport and to be able to sustain taking hits and maybe slipping and pivoting at an awkward angle and being on uneven ground. And so we use a lot of different metrics now that kind of test the athlete to show us when they're ready. And that sort of return to sport clearance usually happens somewhere around 8 to 10 months. But that means cleared for live play. And then they still have to kind of get in shape and do all those other things to be back fully.
That time improved in like the past. It's always kind of been around that time frame.
Actually, there was a time period where it was a lot less. So there was a trend, I would say maybe like 20 years ago or something like that, where we were saying, wow, we can get these athletes back in like 3 or 4 months and cut that time in half. But when we did that, we saw that a lot of re-tears were happening. And so then, we've started going back. And there's actually now data moving in the opposite direction that shows that the graft, when you fix your ACL, we replace it with a different tendon and that grows into your own ligament. But that healing actually continues for up to 2 years. But if you said, hey, we're going to keep you out for 2 years, I think, we would all go out of business because that's just not a reasonable time frame for most athletes. But that is something that we're still actively studying in terms of finding the perfect time, threading the needle to find the optimum recovery with the least risk of re-injury.
Well, especially for a young athlete, say a teenager or someone in their early 20s, it's terrible for someone.
Exactly.
What about Achilles? How long is that these days?
Achilles will probably be about 6 months for a lot of people. So most people will spend some time in crutches and some sort of brace for about 6 weeks, and then not a brace, a support, like a shoe, a boot, and then after that, you'll start to come out of it. So we say you're kind of walking around and doing normal things somewhere around 2 to 3 months, and from there you have to kind of build up towards going from being injured to uninjured and then uninjured to being athletic again. And that's always the hardest part because we can fix people to be uninjured, but getting from being uninjured to athletic after having had a surgery and an injury is probably the hardest part for most people, especially as we get older.
Well, on that note, like, do you find that there's a certain age, is it 30, where an athlete, it just becomes increasingly difficult to recover? Is it 30 or is it younger or is it older?
I would say 30 to 40, like in your 30s, is where we start to see that change. But, it's hard to say because we also see a lot of lifestyle changes around that time period as well. You're not in college anymore. You don't have athletic trainers. Maybe you have kids, you have a full time job. And so your basic level of activity is going to change in addition to your fitness levels. And it's hard to kind of tease apart what's what. But that's where we really start to see, different types of injuries and more trouble with some of these recovery and other aspects that we don't see as commonly in the teens and 20s.
And you mentioned nutrition briefly. Let's spend a moment there. It feels like this world has come a long way as the relation between diet, nutrition, and how it can help with injury prevention and recovery from injury.
Yeah, I think there's still a long way to go. We're just starting to see some early data on the effects of things like vitamin D and tendon health or calcium and things like that. But, as it relates to women specifically, it has to do more with the nutrition issue and eating habits as well. If you look at some of these studies in collegiate athletes, there are some studies that show that almost 2/3 of them have some sort of disordered eating or abnormal eating patterns that can put them at a risk of having some sort of nutritional deficiency. And for women specifically, when you have that nutritional deficiency, then that can alter your hormonal balance. And when your hormonal balance is altered, then your bone metabolism, which is controlled by hormones, gets altered, and that can increase your risk of stress fractures. So all of this kind of ties together very closely, especially in women.
It just feels like this focus on hormones for female athletes is going to be front and center in the future.
Yeah, I think so.
And so I'm curious, what do you do? You're a former serious athlete.
Former.
Well, if it's serious, you know what it's, competed at Stanford, like that. You're a serious athlete and you're busy. What do you do? What do you not do? What do you avoid?
Yes, yes, yes. So I avoid skiing. I'm, like you said, I just treat so many skiers that when I did used to go skiing, it was just being worried about my ACLs the whole time. And so it just wasn't enjoyable for me anymore. I do, a mix of cardio and low impact, activities for cardio. And then I lift weights. We know that cardio is important, for overall fitness and health, and doing it in a low impact way is kind of healthy for your joints. So that's why I do that. And then the weightlifting is really important for maintaining bone strength, especially weight bearing activities. And so those are the things that I do right now. I can't say that it's, as thrilling as playing a sport or doing something recreational, but I consider it, just a way that I invest in my long-term health.
In closing on the future, like, where do you really want? You've been in this field for a long time, and it is exciting, and it's, as I said, I like to say, it's not a moment, it's a movement. Where do you want this to go? Where do you want women's sports medicine to be in 5, 10 years?
Yeah. So, I think there are a couple things that I want. One is that I want there to not be a need for a women's sports medicine program in the future, so that every orthopedic surgeon knows that 50% of their patients are female. And this sort of, right now, sort of niche knowledge is commonplace. I think that needs to happen. The other thing is that, right now, women's sports overall, not just sports medicine, is rapidly evolving. And so we're trying very hard to keep up with that to be able to treat these high level athletes. And, right now, I think there's still a little bit of a lot of discrepancy between what we do for male athletes and what we do for female athletes, not even just in medicine, but, in society. And the reason why we're trying so hard to understand what we're doing for female athletes is because you never know who's going to be the next, the first woman to, do X, Y, or Z, to play in Major League Baseball or to play in the NFL. And if we're constantly seeing these high rates of injuries in these women, then those chances are dropping. And so we're taking a chance on them, trying to, keep everyone as healthy as possible so that women's sports can advance. And as sports advances, I think women's sports medicine will continue to advance. But as I said, ultimately, I'd like to see this just be, common knowledge for everybody instead of specific to women.
Amen. Flag football is going to be an Olympic women's sport in 2028. I had no idea.
Wow. Yeah.
And so we covered a lot of ground today. Is there anything we didn't discuss that you'd like to touch on before we leave, or maybe leave our audience with some words of wisdom?
No, I think the only thing that I would highlight is just how rapidly everything is changing. And so the guidelines that we used 20 years ago, 10 years ago, everything is constantly changing. And so I think people should be aware of that if they're looking for treatments or if they're looking for, the latest to make sure that they're kind of staying up to date on what's happening. Because I think that in 5 years and in 10 years, the way we treat female athletes, the way we do surgeries between males and females is going to be very different from what we're looking at now.
Okay, so I want to ask a question there. Is there something that you think is ripe for disruption in terms of a surgery or treatment where you're like, this is a little inefficient. I could see technology like rapidly changing this?
Yeah, I think right now, AI is changing everything that we do. And even in surgery, there are certain things that are, we do manually, or we measure things, or we, come up with certain algorithms. And a lot of that can be automated. And I think that as we start to see more of this, and we're starting to see it in terms of AR, VR, in surgery right now and surgical techniques, but incorporating more of that into what we do surgery wise, I think is going to increase the precision with which we're able to treat athletes. And so that may fall along gender lines, for males and females, but really just making this about individualized medicine. I think we're going to see a lot of that in the coming years.
Will back surgery ever get better?
We shall see. I hope so.
Because that one back surgery, at one time I looked at having it, like the success rates, that's like one surgery. It's like, probably want to avoid it if you can.
Yeah, back surgery is tough. I think, like with all things, when there's a process of aging involved, right? There are certain things you can fix and certain things that you just can't. And I wouldn't say all back surgery is bad. There's certainly very good indications for some certain types of things. But, when it involves degeneration, it's really, it's tough.
Do you think we'll get to a place in the future with various therapies where we can slow down that degeneration or aging process, whether it's the spine or whatever, mitochondria? Like, do you think we're on the cusp of that?
Yeah. And, I think people always think that we are, but I call it, the fountain of youth, right? And we're still nowhere close to that. But I think the number one thing with all of these things, whether it's stem cells or whatever else we're trying to do to keep people young, it's the application of it. So what works for one person might not work for another person, and being able to individualize that. And then, bringing us kind of back full circle to what we talked about earlier, just the awareness of the fact that we aren't that young anymore, and putting in the time and the effort to be able to maintain certain levels of activity are actually probably the best ways that we can stay healthy going forward.
Well said. Miho, thank you so much.
Thank you.